So thank you for everyone for coming. I'm Anthony Rose, I'm founder and CEO at Sea Beagles. Quick question, so who here is a founder doing their own startup? Is that pretty much everyone? Who's not yet raised any investment for their company? Most people. Who's done one round so far? Raised any investment? All right, okay, a little bit. Okay, cool. So I think then it is perfect for what we're going to talk about. So what I want to go through is every founder journey is different. Every startup idea is hopefully different, but the formula, particularly for a UK round and for running and growing your company, is very self-sufficient. I think my chocolates are a bit distracting. Okay, shut up the door. Okay, so, quick question. Who is a sole founder versus two or more founders? Sole founders, okay. Who's a co-founder with one other person? Alright, and who's got more than one other co-founder? Okay. That actually, so our stats show that two founders is probably the most common, and I'll get onto that in a moment. So your startup journey usually starts with being out running or in the shower or wherever you have ideas. And you have this idea, at some point the idea changes from a hobby into something that you're going to put the next few years of your life into. And if you're a sole founder, it's one thing, but if you have a co-founder, the very first thing that you're going to do is you're going to need to do founder agreements. So the other thing is you're going to incorporate. So has anyone not yet incorporated their company? Okay. The good news is in the UK, £12, company house, an hour of fiddling around, you've got your company. Excellent. And having a company is super important because it means you can now execute legal contracts with investors and with team members. And your goal, and you'll see this throughout the discussion, is to create the company as the vehicle that continues even if individuals come and go. And so investors are going to invest in your company, and they want to see that along the journey, everything is now owned by the company. So, the first thing is founder agreement. So we see in our data maybe about 10% of the time founders split up. You get together with the best goals in the world, but it takes longer than you expect. If you've got bills to pay, maybe you don't agree on the product or working together. And so if founders split up, one of the founders may own half the shares. So when you've incorporated 50 shares each of the company's house, somebody leaves. If you don't have a founder agreement with share vesting in place, if they leave, then firstly they may have a dispute about who owns the intellectual property of the business. And that kills your investability. As soon as investors don't see an unbroken chain of ownership, that the company owns everything they can invest in, then they go too complicated, all the agreements will come back later. I'll get back to that. The other thing is if the founder who's left owns a half or a third or whatever of the shares, maybe they're antagonistic at this point. But either way, if half of the shares of the company are owned by somebody underperforming, that greatly reduces your investability. So thing one is if you do have a co-founder, make sure they sign a founder agreement. We've got two of those. Obviously, legals, they're both completely free. One of them is a founder pledge. No one's being paid a salary yet. And the other is a founder service agreement. But either way, they've really got 3 or 4 provisions. One, the founders agree that they'll put a substantial time and effort into growing the company. They won't set up a competing business. If they leave, they won't solicit employees from the team and so on. Number 2, if they leave in a certain period, they have to give back some of their shares. That's technically reverse vesting. So you own your shares up front, but if you leave, typically over 3 years, you have to give back some of your shares. And lastly, perhaps to some extent most importantly, you assign all the intellectual property in the business, in the project, to the company. And this is super important because we find, as I said, surprisingly often founders split up. And then there's a problem, it was my idea, and no, I wrote the source code, and I own this module, and it basically kills everything. And so what you want is that the remaining people can continue, and it's business as usual. So I invested in 3 delightful students doing a startup a couple of years ago, and after about a year, the 2 marketing people iOS developer who was fantastic kept going. And because I'd insisted as an investor that they all had signed founder agreements, they could remain as good friends. The people who left kept 1/3 of their shares, about 2/3 of the shares, and it was nice and easy. Worse customers we see who haven't got these was a bit of a mess. Okay, so thing one is founder agreements. Let me talk briefly about protecting your intellectual property. So you have an idea, it's a hobby, ideas are cheap, implementation's expensive. What IP protection do you need? And I think it falls into a few classes. Thing number one, copyright. Don't bother with that. Copyright is essentially implicit. You don't need to spend any time filing copyright rules. Number two, protecting the ownership of the code for the company, which means anyone who works on the project, graphics designers, people in Ukraine building it, whatever, you have to have a contract with them that says all work output is owned by the company, and if it's anyone who's done work on it before the company was started, ideally to say even work we've done before the incorporation is owned by the company. Thing number three is trademarks. So trademarks, I usually trademark all the things, or at least try to trademark all the things I get involved with. Trademarks are a double-edged sword. So you ideally, the good news with trademarks is in the UK, they're very inexpensive, it costs about £200. You can go to the ico.gov.uk Information Commission Officer website and you can lodge a trademark application. And I really recommend it, but there's a little asterisk there. So the amusing thing on the trademark website is that trademarks are done by category. So if anyone, I'll give you the quick 101 on trademarks to save you spending a lot of time researching it. They're done by category. The category list was put together in about 1875, and there are lots of categories about type of milling and hat making, and about 4 for the entire internet. So most times, trademarks are enforced by category. So somebody can be Apple Juice, and then there's Apple Computer, and in theory they don't compete, but don't try and register anything with Apple because they're a bit special. But, so you're going to pick some categories, and they're usually about internet service providers, internet software providers, online service providers, whatever. And now, the next thing to know is trademarks are done phonetically. So it doesn't matter if you spell your name Apple without an E on the end, whatever, it's always read by the Trademark Office as the way it's spoken. And the idea is to avoid people being confused that you're passing off or trading on someone else's marketing and so on. So now the problem is you find a cool name, which is hard enough anyway. You've gone to GoDaddy, you've bought your domain name, and now you go to the Trademark Office to trademark it. The first thing is you'll search to find if there are any others. And if you do find some others, then you've got a problem, which is you now need to make a value judgment or pay a trademark lawyer to figure out whether it's probably okay or probably not okay. But assuming it's probably okay, you then lodge an application. And what the Trademark Office do is they then write to anyone who's got a phonetically similar name, in other words, a competing potential name, to alert them that someone wants to trademark this and give them 90 days or something like that to lodge an objection. And the problem that this causes is that you may have found that there is Apple Combine Harvest, well, let's not say Apple, Joe's Combine Harvesters or something like that, and you call yourself Joe's Combine Stock Options, completely different, but you probably have gotten away with it. They would never have noticed your company. They would look one day and find the company and go, that's nothing like us, knock yourself out. But because the Trademark Office write to them, if they don't object, they're kind of forced to lose that. So they really are now obligated to object. And if they object, then the Trademark Office try to get you to mediate and work it out. But it becomes a whole palaver. So with these 3 students that I invested in, I said, we're going to trademark your name. The company was called PAPT, for paparazzi with students. It was quite fun. But it turned out the Trademark Office said this company called PAPT-IT for a trademark. The company had never launched a product that I think still haven't launched. But that then led to dispute, and because neither of us wanted to spend a great deal of money on it, we settled somewhat amicably, but the whole thing took like a year. So my suggestion is definitely research who might have a competing trademark, because you don't want to be trespassing on someone who is going to try and shut down your name. But be cautious if you file the trademark that it will then alert the others. And the last thing on trademarks is in the UK, it's super easy to do. If you want to do it in the US, they've got a bewilderingly complicated system that I've been unable to figure out. So I pay a US trademark lawyer. It starts at about $1,000 or so, but when I wanted to trademark Seed Legals, there was a law firm called Seed Law or something. Anyway, it cost me like $5,000 or $8,000 finally to get my Seed Legals trademark in the US, so be aware it can get a bit expensive. The next thing on intellectual property is patents. So we all see on Dragon's Den where people come in and go, yeah, I've got a worldwide patent. Chances are this is not right. I've got about 13 patents. It takes on average about 5 years to get a patent, and probably costs about £20,000 per country. So firstly, they had to start years ago. Secondly, there's no such thing as a worldwide patent. And thirdly, they've spent hundreds of thousands, much more than they're ever going to get from the dragons on these patents. So I think patents are probably quite useful if you're doing genetics or something like that, and quite useless in the world of software. And what happened is, I found my batting average was about 1 in 3. So of the patents you file, about 3 years later, after many going backwards and forwards and going through objections and talking to the patent office, about 1 chance in 3 you finally get your patent. You get back to the office and you go, team, congrats, we got a patent on X. And they go, I don't think we're doing that anymore. No, we started like ages ago. Dude, that's old tech. So my take is, if investors ask you about patents, unless you're in an area of something genetic, whatever, if it's anything to do with software, business and so on, I think it really is a waste of time and money. And your goal then is to explain to investors, only on Dragon's Den, to people at patents. I think there might be a video on our Seed Legals website where I say essentially this about patents. If you find it, Google Seed Legals patents, you can probably send your investor there. And your goal is to explain to the investor it's probably not the best use of their funds to spend £20,000 over some period, and importantly take you and your team's time off doing the development of your products. So, so I think that's it on patents, trademarks, IP. Any questions on founder agreements, vesting, or other things? No questions. Okay, next. So now comes giving equity to your team. So as a startup, you're equity rich, you've got shares, you can give them away, but you're cash poor, you don't have any money. So your goal is to potentially give some shares or share options to your team instead of giving them some cash. And that starts with the founders, where they start by, between them, owning 100% of the shares in the company, split up whichever way you like. And now when you bring in your next hire, you perhaps are funding the business yourself. So if you don't have the money to pay the market rate, you may top up with some equity instead. And how much equity should you give team members? And it's a difficult thing to figure out. And so a couple of things. Firstly, my starting point is to try and work out the value of the equity that you might give in pounds, because then it makes it very easy. So if you think my company's worth £500,000 and I'm giving 5% equity, that's £25,000. And then my suggestion is, the purpose of equity is the difference between what the person, your developer, might have earned as a market rate versus what you can pay them. If they're earning market rate, there's not much point giving them equity other than as a fund bonus or something like that, because why would they go elsewhere? You're already paying the market rate. So equity, in a sense, is, I mean, there are many reasons for it. It could be part of team bonding and so on, but largely, in my view, it's to offset the difference between what you're paying the person and what their market rate would be otherwise. And as the founder, that reaches its high point, because when you start the company, you're probably not earning anything. That's why you have all or 50 or 30% of the equity, depending on the number of founders. So once you have that in mind, and you think about the company valuation, which we'll get to in a minute, then it starts making sense how much equity. And also you can explain to your team members when your CTO goes, I want 20%. You go, well, see, if we're not paying you anything for the next 6 months because we've got no money, and you'd earn, let's say, 60K a year, so that's 30K value, and let's say our valuation is £500,000, you might work it out and say, actually, you'll get a certain amount of equity that really represents 6 months of no pay, plus a certain amount afterwards, because you'll be paying 40K a year after our initial round, and later on it will catch up and so on. So you can work out a sort of formula that gives people what feels about right, and as a founder, you want to meet two goals. One, give out some equity in lieu of cash, but two, as the business grows, you might look back a few years later after a few rounds and find yourself with far less equity than you had in mind, and you'll look back ruefully at the equity you dished out to advisors and so on. So, before we get to advisors, a quick thing on how to give out, whether you should give shares or share options. So let me explain the difference. So shares are things that exist today and they have a value. And if you give people shares, if their value is 1 cent a share or whatever it is when you incorporate it on a company's house, great, there's no capital gains tax problem for them. But if you give them shares at the time that you've raised investment and the company, let's say you give someone 5% equity after your first round when you have a valuation of £500,000, they're getting about £25,000 of value. And that means they're going to be liable for capital gains tax on that £25,000. If it was someone you're giving shares to because you can't pay them, they might be slightly distressed when their accountant at the end of the year says, I think you owe HMRC £10,000 for those shares. And so, even worse, if the person's an employee and you give them value, the company is then liable for national insurance, PAYE, pension, and so on that value. So, just as if you pay a contractor, their taxes are their problem. If you give a contractor shares or share options, their tax is their problem. If it's an employee, when you pay them, you have to pay PAYE and national insurance. And if you give them value as shares or share options, the company may well have to pay deemed benefits, tax, and so on. And it could be a really expensive mistake. So if you've given your team hundreds of thousands of pounds of shares or share options and they exercise them later, you may find yourself with a hefty tax bill. So the way it works is you create what's called an EMI, share option scheme. Let me take a step back. The way you give people shares or equity falls clearly into two modes. One, I'm giving shares with what's called a reverse vesting schedule. So I'm giving you all your shares now, but if you leave in some period, you have to give some of them back again. It's called reverse vesting. And as founders, that's what you have, because you have to own all the shares in the company, so you have them up front when they were created at no cost, so there's no tax on your shares. Maybe when you sell the company, you'll sell your shares one day, there will be, but not for now. If you leave, you give some back, reverse vesting. Once the company has a value, or often just to be safe for an employee, instead you give share options. And share options give the person the right to buy shares at a future time. And now there are two ways that plays out. One of them is if it's a contractor, you may give them shares with what's called an exercise or a strike price of 1 penny or so. This means they can buy the share, they have the right to buy the share at any time in the future for 1 cent per share. So if your shares are worth £10 each and they've got 1,000 shares, it's £10,000 value, they're going to write a check for 1,000 and then that's a penny each, £10. At some point after they're vested, they can now buy the shares. But when they buy the shares, because they're only paying 1 cent each, you can set it to whatever you like, but typically it's 1 cent each, they then get the value of the share, they don't have a capital gains tax liability. So when people exercise their shares, you should know and you should explain to them, because that's the behavior you want, they have the right to buy the shares as soon as they've vested. So they get a bit of share, or some share options that are vesting each month, they have the right to buy it. But if they're sane, they won't buy them or exercise the option until the company exits or they want to sell the underlying share, which might be on a future funding round, at which point they'll pay capital gains tax on the difference between what they bought the exercise the option for and what they sold the share for, which is great because they sold the share. But they would be stupid, and you should tell your team that they would be stupid to just buy the share, exercise the option, like 3 months later. Because all they're doing is they now are liable for capital gains tax on a share that may ultimately have no value. So one last thing, and then I'll go to questions, because it's a bit of a technical error, but getting it right super early is super important. As I said, when you give value to contractors, their tax problems are their tax problems. When you give it to an employee, their tax problems also become the company's tax problems. And as I said, if you were to give them something of value, the company may have tax liabilities. So HMRC has come up with a solution called an EMI option scheme. EMI means Enterprise Management Incentive. And the idea is that you agree a valuation with HMRC. Let's say your company's worth £3 million after your first Series A round or your first seed round, and £3 million valuation. For an employee to not pay any tax, they would essentially buy their shares, they'd exercise their options at a £3 million valuation. This is very nice, but completely useless because they're just buying it at market value. If they were to get it at 1 cent, they're getting fantastic value, but they're going to pay a lot of capital gains tax. What the EMI scheme says is, you're going to agree with HMRC a lower valuation. And HMRC agree that at that valuation, employees and the company won't pay any tax. So this is called the EMI valuation. And your goal is to try and get the lowest valuation you can, because that's the maximum upside for the employee. They don't have to pay that for their shares, they have to pay that for their shares, while simultaneously telling your investors the valuation is much more. So you're telling your investors, my valuation is 3 million, HMRC, $500,000, if that. And so how do you do this two-sided thing? And of course, given HMRC, it means, there's no diddling involved. And the idea is that you give share options that are converted to shares with different rights to your employees than your investors will get. So your investors might get ordinary shares, preference shares, with dividend and voting rights. But for your employees, you might give them B ordinary shares with no voting rights and no dividend rights, and some vesting and other things. And then you spend a lot of effort explaining to HMRC why these shares are worth very little and these ones are worth a lot, while also telling your employee, actually, they're very much the same, you're all worth the same. And the reality is, question.
Yes, what's the delta normally between valuations?
What's the delta? Very good question. So, yeah. So generally the goal is to try and get a 70% discount from HMRC. So if you said 3 mil, can I get half a mil? But routinely companies often try for 90% or more discounts. And to do that, you need to be very clever in the approach you take. So it used to be the case, until the beginning of this year, you'd tell HMRC, my employees get non-voting shares. Can I get a 70% discount? And they go, yep, you're in. Now they go, 5%, that's it. So what we've done at Seed Legals is we've developed a 12-step approach of all the differences that may accrue, and we've put sort of 5%, 10%. When you add it all up, you may get to 70 to 90% difference. But that means you need to consider very early on the types of shares or share options you give to your team. Anyway, we can help with all of that, but it's a fun exercise. And so just remember the key rules. If your shares have no value, you can happily give shares to people, always with vesting. And if the shares have a value, you can give share options. And if it's an employee, it will be per an EMI option scheme. And then the last thing, just because people get confused, if you give shares, they'll have what's called reverse vesting. In other words, you get the shares up front. Why? Because the shares have little value today, and the person needs to get all the shares. But if they leave, they give them back. Whereas if you give share options, they've got forward vesting, so they get options incrementally, and they can cash them in essentially later. Question?
Can you please ask, what does it mean to give back?
Right, give back,
What
yes.
happens with those shares?
Good point. So what is give back? Who do you give it back to? So in the company's articles, if you've created company articles that include vesting provisions, it spells out in detail what happens. So typically, let's say there are two founders and they've got 3-year vesting. So it says, I've got 50 shares and each month 1/36 of them vests, and the founder now leaves after 1 year. What happens? So the articles will typically say that the unvested shares, in this case, 2/3 of the shares, will now be sold back to the other shareholders or the company or the other founder at whatever the nominal value is typically. So what you do is, with vesting, you can define different types of levers. These are called the lever provisions. And this is something to know about. Slight segue for now, that when you have your funding round, we'll get to that in seconds, there are a few contentious points in the funding round. The funding round is lots of legal documents, but ultimately it boils down to a half dozen key things that you're going to agree with your investor that represents a balance between the founders of the company interests and investor protections. And one of the things the investors are likely to insist on, if it's a friends and family investor, probably won't care. If it's an angel investor, may care. If it's a fund, will say for sure. They're going to insist that if the founders leave, because they've just on paper made them millionaires from their investment, they don't want them leaving and keeping all their shares and perhaps killing the business. They say if you leave, you have to give back some of the shares. And the lever provisions will typically be called good lever, bad lever, we've got voluntary and a forced lever. So industry standard is good and bad, we add 2 more. Let me explain what that means. So good lever, ironically, is someone who dies. It's no fault of your own, you die, you're too sick to continue working, and typically, and here what's interesting is on seed legals in general, you can define what you want, but the norm would be that you or your estate sells back to the company a nominal value, like a cent a share, the unvested shares, and you keep the vested ones, because you put the work in, you keep them, or your family would keep them. A bad lever is somebody who's fired for gross misconduct or diddling the books or whatever it is, and typically they might lose all of their shares. Or you might say, that's a bit unfair. You might lose only your invested ones, but keep your vested ones. So it's interesting when, as particularly co-founders, you go through the vesting provisions and you set up together what you want in your founder agreements. It's a sort of a 3-way game, which is, for me, no matter how I leave, I always want my shares. If my co-founder leaves, bastard, they need to give back some of their shares. And for the investor, if either of you leave, you need to keep some and give back others. And so, if you're the founders, normally your vesting would be what's called straight line 3 years. So it says, essentially saying, when I start on this idea, I'm putting time and effort, money value into it on a daily basis. So my shares vest a little bit more every month. And after 3 years, I've got all of them. Investors often take a bit more of a binary approach. They say, we're investing in these kids, some crazy new idea, I don't know if they'll stick together. If one of them leaves in the next 3 months, because that's offered right after a funding round, there's tensions, I don't want them to have anything. So investors often push for what's called a 4-year with a 1-year cliff. This means your options or your shares vest over 4 years, but if you leave in the first year, you get nothing. At the end of the first year, you catch up and you get 25%, and then a bit more month on month. And this is a way of making sure that it pushes the founders to stay together, and also avoids having a founder who leaves after some weeks because actually they just weren't really a fit, or they had some disagreement, but they're still a minor shareholder and being a nuisance. So it becomes quite binary. Question?
Does that create a tax issue? Or?
Right, very good point. So there's, the tax system recognizes vesting, If the person sells their shares for a nominal value of a penny, they're not making any money, so there's no tax to be paid. So generally there's no tax liable on the share giving back of unvested shares. If the person sells their shares later for a profit, then they may pay, or they probably will pay tax. Question?
So in the example you just gave, if the leaving co-founder is selling the shares at nominal price back to the main founder, right, at whatever, 1 penny, etc., and by that time they're having 2 or 3 rounds of funding, will the founder who is buying those shares, will they be liable for the capital gains?
That is a very good point. I don't know the answer. It's going to vary by circumstance, and that's why when you create the vesting provisions, which will appear in your company's articles, you may set, sometimes the other founders want to be able to buy them themselves. They say that, you know, we own collectively 50% of the shares, and we want to keep owning 50% regardless. But in that model, they may well need to pay capital gains tax on the value they've created. So to avoid that, another way is to say all shareholders have the right to buy them, or the company can buy them and then cancel them. So the company buying them and cancelling them is the default, which basically says somebody has left, we essentially evaporate those shares, so everyone else owns a bit more equity, a bigger slice of a smaller pie. And that means that we can then issue more shares to some new person later, which dilutes everyone again to get back to the same position. So you might think about, if a person leaves, you want to be able to replace them and incentivize a new person. If the founders were to get the shares back themselves, I would expect that they would then have to give their shares to the new person, otherwise it's unfair. If everyone gets back, or you cancel the shares, then it's fair to create more shares. Everyone went up a little bit, and then everyone goes down a bit. Okay. Question?
Just going back to the EMI, my only question with that is, would you recommend doing that, especially when you're starting out, before the first funding round?
Right.
Or are there reasons why you can do it in between?
That is a very good point. So, in a sense, the earlier you do it, the lower the valuation you can agree with HMRC. The problem is twofold. One, it's quite expensive to set up, it's like £2,500. You've probably got better things to spend your money on really early on, and after a round, you do have some money. The second thing is that the valuation you get is only valid for 60 days. So you can't sort of agree a valuation unless you plan to hire someone at that point. So yes, you could set it up literally tomorrow if you're going to hire a few people, give them their options tomorrow, but there's no point setting it up well ahead of when you were going to hire someone. Okay, question?
Can I just not put the options in the pool? So although I want hiring one for a year, I just have my dedicated option pool with.
Good point. Okay, so let me take a step back on options. When you give people share options, there are really 3 things to do. Number one, you have a contract with them promising them, hey, you're going to get paid 50k a year and we're going to give you 1% of the company in the form of options that will vest over 3 years. Great. Where are these options coming from? So thing 2, you need to create an option pool. And an option pool, it's nothing physical. It's a reservation saying, I have the right to create this number of shares later. And what your goal is, or what your investors' goals are to create that before the next funding round. Because when you create an option pool, you're essentially saying, I can give people these options, and when I do, it's going to dilute everyone that was beforehand a shareholder. So when investors come along, they want to invest 100k or 10% of the company or something like that. They don't want right after that to go, the 10%, you're now 9% because I created an option pool. So investors will generally push you to create what's called a pre-money option pool that's created before the funding round. If you it sounds all complicated, if you do it on Seed Legals, the platform works it all out for you, and 10% pre-money option pool is the norm. But creating an option pool is just a line item in your cap table. There's nothing to it. It just says, by the way, there's this reservation of things, so when we create more shares afterwards, they come after that. You don't need to do anything. And the third thing later on is to create the scheme, but there's no real rush on that. Question?
Yes, that's salary sacrifice.
Yes.
So say I have a staff member,
Yeah.
not paying their market rate, just because I can't quite afford to get, but they're happy with that. salary, but
Yeah.
say it's half.
Yep.
Market rate is 100, you're paying them 50, and you want to top that up with options, equity,
Yeah.
whatever it
Yeah.
might be. Is there a formula about how you work out how many options to give in, how much shares, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think as I suggested earlier, you might think about the company's valuation and then equate it to that. So, you know, my company's worth 500k, 5% of the shares and options were worth 25k. You know, your market rate is 60k, I'm giving you 35 plus 5% options.
Okay.
I think would be right. Remember that everyone's options or everyone's percent equity gets diluted in each round. Because you're always creating more shares, but on the other hand, the value goes up. So, two questions, one here and then one there.
Well,
Okay.
further to this question
Yeah.
here, say they're not getting any salary.
Right.
Is it more common to have like reverse vesting or the cliff period?
Okay, if you're not being paid any salary, if I was the employee or advisor, I would say I want my, you pay me on a monthly basis in cash, so I want to get my options or shares on a monthly basis. Otherwise, if you set a cliff and the person stops working after 3 months, they get nothing, that doesn't seem right. So it seems right if it's a bonus for being around, or it's important that the person is around, but if it's a number of money, I think you have the vesting matching what you give them as money. Question back.
Yeah. Let's say I have an employee outside of UK and I give him 10% of the company in shares, not options. Am I liable for any other tax?
I don't know the answer to that. I suspect their problems are their problems because they're not in the UK. If they live in Luxembourg or Dubai, it's easy, they've got no tax elsewhere, but that's something you're going to have to get legal advice on. I just don't know the answer. It will vary by country, and if it's in the EU or not, and so on, I just don't know. All right, one more question, then I'll move on.
Going back to the number of shares that you give to the first employees of the company, I get your example when you are in a position where you can actually define the value of the company.
Yes.
But when it's in very early stages and probably the sum of the salaries that the 3 or 4 people that are working at the company is probably higher than the value of the company, right? How can you, how do you allot the percentages of ownership of the company?
It's a great question, and I think for the founders, not only are you likely to not earn any salary for a while, you're in fact likely from your own pocket to be funding the company. So it's all really a leap of faith that you're going to get some equity, and can you put a value to it? But I'm going to hold on the valuation thought for actually perfectly timed. So let's now say that you've got your founders in place, you've got some team members, and you've got an idea. And so I'm going to take you quickly through what I like to think about is, the journey by valuation of a company. So it works to be like this. 1 or 2 or 3 founders have an idea, you meet in a pub. And ideas are cheap, implementation's expensive. So at an idea, is anyone going to invest? I mean, if you've got an idea, I'm going to make a GPS-enabled bicycle lock. How much, it's worth £1 million. Well, I don't think I'm going to invest based on you just made it up. You have to do something. So I look at everything of the journey of a startup as sort of ripples in a pond. It sounds a bit existential, but bear with me. So founders have an idea. You drop the stone into the pond. And the first thing is, we see on our C-Legal's data that founders spend a median of £26,000 of their own money creating something before the first round. Because just going, I've got this idea, few people would invest in that. So you need to do some research, build a prototype, make some mock-ups, do something. You might engage some contract developer to make it a simple version of an app. And the data shows, again, founders putting their own money in initially, the bootstrapping, and £26,000. Some people put a lot more, but that's the median. The next thing is then to raise typically friends and family money. So you might raise £50,000, giving your investors SEIS. We'll get back to that in a minute. The next ripple is raising maybe £150,000 from angel investors with SEIS. The next ripple is a seed round, maybe £500,000 to £700,000 from angel investors and maybe early stage funds. And the next ripple is your perhaps Series A, raising £1 or £2 or £3 million from typically funds. And your goal, and once you think of it like this, then to me there's clarity on everything. Your goal is to raise 3 to 5 times the amount at each ripple, at 3 to 5 times the valuation each time round, such that after the third round, the founders still have the majority shareholding, and after 3 rounds, you either have a growing, profitable business that you don't need to raise again, or you have a business that you're ready to exit and everyone makes a nice return on their investment and you go do it again. So if you think of it that way, of course, some companies go on to raise forever or raise huge amounts, but I think that's a good rule of thumb. And it doesn't mean you have to do each of these ripples. You can skip a few. You may not do a bootstrap round, 50K, and an angel round, or you might go directly to a later one. But typically, you may see 3 rounds for an exit or till steady state growth afterwards. And if you're going to give away only enough equity each time round, so that after the third round, the founders still have more than 50% of the shares, that means you're going to give away something like 15% equity in each funding round. So your goal is to give away that amount of equity. So now when it comes to valuing the company, I think there are a few ways to do it. So you've got your idea for this GPS bicycle lock. And maybe you've made a PowerPoint showing that they could sell 1 million of them in London and 1 billion of them across the world. And now you want to raise investment. And your investor says, looks interesting, I love the graphics, you pay 20K for those graphics. And what's the valuation? And now you need to justify it. And I think there are a few ways of doing it. Way number 1, read TechCrunch and take a 0 off the end, because those are crazy American valuations. No one here will invest on those valuations. Thing 2, take your spreadsheet that you've calculated your gross sales and so on, and give that to your investor. But if I'm the investor, I think those spreadsheets are bullshit, because the numbers are insane. I mean, one company was saying that by 2022 they're to be doing £500 million a year in revenue. That would make them like a FTSE 100 company. All the FTSE 100 companies have been around for decades. Their growth would be faster than Twitter. It's unlikely. So it's wonderful that the blockchain company will be doing that revenue, but statistically unlikely. So I'm not a big fan of the spreadsheet revenue forecasts. The other way is to try and look at what other companies similar to yours are valued at. So you might look at UK Tech News, UKTN website, where they'll list lots of fundraisers. But the problem is everyone is happy to talk about how much they raise, but nobody mentions the valuation. So that's not very useful. So what we've done is we've looked at data on sleep legals, and we've seen that over hundreds of funding rounds, companies give away a median of 15% equity in a round. And that matches very nicely the sort of ripples, which is if you give away 15%, 15%, 15%, you're still left with 60% or something like that equity after doing it 3 times the founders if you started with 100. So this graph is really useful in 2 ways. Way number 1 is, particularly in early stage rounds, and sometimes when VCs come along later, you may find a friends and family investor, you and they have no idea how much equity to give away. So in the absence of a graph like this, they might go, I'll invest 20K for 30% of the company. You're like way down here. You can use this graph to go, this is a bad thing to do, because if I give away too much equity too early, later investors know that this makes you uninvestable because the founders have little incentive afterwards. I see founders who proudly, on UKTN, we've raised 100 million or 50 million or 20 million. The founders are sitting like 14% equity or something. It's just not that attractive anymore. So the other thing is sometimes people are raising and giving away very small amounts of equity. And that to me indicates one of two or three things. One of them is their valuation is way too high. You've got to a bicycle lock idea and immediately you've been reading TechCrunch, or you look at the Crowdcube or Cedars numbers and you go, I'm going to raise on a 3 million valuation. The problem if you raise on too high a valuation early on is initially the company doesn't have revenue, probably doesn't have users. So people are investing based on the potential, the hype, the founders, the story you're telling. But once the product's launched, it then becomes obvious what the traction is. And if you've raised a too high a valuation and you can't sustain that hype, then you may not be able to raise that valuation again. And if you can't, that's called a down round. And it's kind of a downer for the existing investors because in a sense they've lost money and they're getting diluted. So for me, I'm always a big fan of rewarding your early investors and giving them upside and picking the right valuations that you have a high likelihood of raising it 2 or 3x that valuation a little later on and using that money to get traction. So the other thing we've noticed, and this is something I've been working on, I've got some nice graphs and hopefully an article in the next couple of weeks, which is the way funding rounds are done today. It turns out to be, you raise every 12 to 18 months to raise enough money to last that period. And this is a sort of 12 to 18 month go big or go bust cycle. And it goes something like this. I need money to get to the next step. It's going to take me a few months, maybe 3 months to find investors. And then it may take me 3 months to close the rounds. That's 6 months. And now if I'm going to raise more at a later next round and a few times the valuation and a few times more, the ripples in the pond, something has to change between now and then. So I need maybe 6 months of traction and development to actually have anything change. So that's now 12 months. And I can't risk trading insolvent, so I need at least 3 months worth of money in the bank. So that's like 15 months. So you can see these cycles that occur. But does it have to be that way? And one of my passions has been to try and change that. So what I noticed when we ran the numbers, we found that there was this little blip over here. And what we found were people were raising small amounts of money frequently. And they were doing that because on Seed Legals, it's way faster. On a Saturday night, you can log in and create a document. So we call that now the rise of continuous funding. And it created the set of tools that intentionally let you change the way you're raising from this go big or go bust cycle to, at the end of an event like this, someone says, hey, I love what you're doing, can I invest 5K? And instead of saying, come back in December, you can go, what's your email? I'll send you a document now. So we'll get back to that in a moment. So, question?
Yes, so I'm a big fan of the platform. I'm just wondering, who are your customers, like family and friends, or established VCs? My experience so far is that people are resistant to new things. Not for a law firm that will help me on the legal side, but I would like I would kindly ask them to basically use the platform, whereby I would expect a pushback on the to do this way, either you or not.
Sure. So, it's slight diversion, but my goal, go for it. Yep. So, my goal is to transform the way people do particular things. So when you go to a law firm does one funding round, or that lawyer does one funding round a month. So they've got a very few sets of data points. And it takes them 3 days to write you articles. My computer takes 100 milliseconds, and I've got hundreds of rounds of data. So what I can do, unlike a law firm, is I can productize things and create packages of things that will help you do what you want, rather than you telling a law firm what you think you want, and then they'll charge you to do it. It's a different discussion. This isn't about pitching Seed Legals, but I can tell you, I mean, people do range from 50K to several million.
So I'm thinking both combined. You're telling me that the platform would be enough, would be sufficient?
Our goal is you don't need a law firm, but let's discuss it afterwards. Okay. All right. So then, to wrap up on the valuation. So from this, I think one of the important things is if you're giving away 15% equity, as the data shows is most common in a round, you can almost work out your valuation by just picking the amount you need to get to the next traction and multiplying it by 5. So if you, let's say, raise, let's say you need £100,000. You multiply it by 5, that means your pre-money valuation is £500,000. After your round, your valuation, your post-money valuation will be the 500 plus the 100 you raised is 600,000. And your investors will own 100 out of the 600,000. So your investors will own 16%, which is spot on the money. So, in a sense, using a 15% rule of thumb, it doesn't mean it has to be, I mean, it's not everyone doing that, there's a spectrum, means that you figure out what you need to get to the next level of traction, and that indicates your valuation. But in a sense, you're just shifting the buck somewhere else, because how much do you need? Is it 100,000? Is it a million? And there, the second thing, and if you go on the Seed Legal's website in Resources Deal Data, there's this chart and an explanation. I think valuations go pretty much like this. It's a bit facetious. Two people get together, have an idea, create a PowerPoint, £300,000 valuation. You've built some simple prototype, £500,000 valuation. You've got it live, you've got a few people using it, 700K. You've got a decent number of users, £1 million. You've got revenue, £2 million valuation. And although it sounds slightly facetious and mileage varies, it's actually quite useful, because what happens, and here's advice, usually about this point someone says, should I look, where do I find investors? Well, what happens is investors fall into 3 groups, friends and family, angel investors, and funds. Angel investors usually are coming in at valuations under £1 million. They will usually think about a company, if the valuation is more than £1 million, there would be an expectation that you would have users and traffic. And if your valuation was more than £2 million, there's an expectation that you've got revenue. If you have a valuation that's mismatched from your level of traction, there's in general, the discussion ends with a comeback later. So that sort of million, south of $1 million, not yet launched, limited traction. Above $1 million to $2 million, you've got users but not revenue, and above $2 million, revenue. So it doesn't mean it has to be that way. Some ideas are much bigger, some things are much more capital intensive, but for your standard app, restaurant, whatever it might be, that rule of thumb quite well matches investor expectations. And really everything you're looking to do is to match investor expectations to reduce the friction of your investability. You look like you had a question.
Yeah, just a quick one. Really about how you would classify revenue. Because could revenue be £10 a month or £10,000 a month or more? So,
sure. Good point. So once you've got some revenue, in later stage rounds, investors will simply take valuation as might be something like 10x annual revenue. So if you're doing £1 million a year or £100,000 a month in revenue, that might be more like a 10 million valuation. So, but it's a good point. So if you, let's say, many companies will quite quickly get to 5 to 10 or 15,000 pounds a month of revenue. It's fantastic. You've got people using your product. You saw 8 people or something like that. You've got some revenue that may well be, so let's say it's 200K a year, you may well be at £2 million or so valuation for that. So let me talk quickly about where to find investors. Obviously at events like this, that with exponential events, but the idea is, I hear the same story again and again, which goes something like this. I don't know any angel investors, so I did a Google search, or I went on the Seed Legal's website for the 17 funds or lists of funds, and I found some funds, and I went and met the funds, and I pitched, and they said, love what you're doing, but the discussion ended with come back later. And so if you go to funds too early, it generally ends with come back later. And the discussion is something like this. Funds raise a large amount of money, £100 million, which they then need to invest. They've only got a certain amount of bandwidth, so they can only do 10 or 20 or so deals a year, which means they need to have an investment of £1 million or more. It varies by fund. Some are 10 million, some are £500,000 per investment. So they can't do that many investments, and so their minimum investment, depending on an early stage fund, let's say £500,000, at a slightly later stage is £1 million or £2 million. And if they know the rule, roughly, then they might say, if our minimum investment is 500,000, and we're expecting other people in the round as well, so you're going to raise £1 million, and that means your valuation might be 4 million, and that means we're expecting you to be making 40k a month or so in revenue to be in that sort of zone. So when you go to them with your bicycle lock idea, the discussion goes like this: love your bicycle lock, it's amazing. What are you doing in revenue? It's like, well, we haven't launched it yet. Ah, right. Sorry, our minimum ticket is 500k. Come back. Well, you know what? Why? It's just as easy. You know, you're only looking for 200k, but it's just as easy to raise 500k as 200k. I mean, the legal cost is the same. Why don't you raise 500k instead? And you're going, that sounds great. I was only looking for 200. These people told me I'm worth way more. So you're going to rewrite your slide deck instead of needing 200k because you're going to have 3 developers. You're now going to have 8 developers, and you can need more. And you come back 2 weeks later with, I'm now looking to raise 500k. And they go, amazing. What's your revenue? And you go, well, same as last week. Have it into it. You know, love what you're doing, but it's a bit too early. Come back later. So I think in pre-revenue and certainly pre-launch and traction, angel investors are your friends. And what I would recommend, I have no idea if it's right for you, but the good news is the cost of finding out if it's right or wrong is about 0, is as follows. Do a Google search for how to download my LinkedIn contacts. You can get a nice CSV file export from LinkedIn. You've probably got thousands of contacts. Step 2, make a nice little 50-word message. Amazing new bicycle, GPS-enabled bicycle lock, finds your bicycle wherever it is, if it's stolen or you lose it. Offering SEIS and EIS, have advance assurance. We'll get back to that. Those are the magic words. Raising 150k, and then a nice little photo done by your graphics guys of said bicycle lock, and be completely shameless. Email that, obviously using MailChimp or Manual or something, to everyone on your contact list. If you have any people using your product, send it out to them. Post it on Facebook, put it on Twitter, tell everyone you do it, be completely shameless. Thing 2, and 3, make a product deck. So product deck shows what it is you're creating, the competition, the market segment, the team, but it doesn't have any financials in it. So when people write back going, hey, sounds interesting, you can then follow up and send them a product deck, but you're not giving away your business plan or valuation. And the reason you're not is, firstly, because it's a bit more confidential, and secondly, it might change. Your first investors might go, £1 million is too much, I'll invest in 800k. You don't want to have different people with lots of different variants of your valuation. So if people respond, you can now send them your product. And step 3, make now the full investor deck, which has got the business plan, how much you're looking to raise, and so on. I can't say it will work, but the good news is the effort to figure out if it's going to work or not is minimal compared to paying advisors, visiting funds. I mean, literally tomorrow you can have feedback. And what's fascinating is the feedback. Some people go, yep, sounds great. Some people will tell you who the competitors are that you didn't know about. I'm amazed on a call with a customer that I know nothing about their industry, but I know 3 competitors that they don't know, and that's really bad. The other thing is you find huge amounts of networking. My brother has a bicycle franchise, let me do an intro. So spreading the word very wisely, particularly with this particular outcome you're looking for investment. The other thing is, when people do respond, if they're looking to invest, the next thing is to create a term sheet and essentially set up your round. And that's where really see legals is your friend, because you can hop on literally this evening and essentially at no cost, set up your cap table, enter a valuation. It will work out the exact amounts of equity that you're giving away. So when the investor asks you a question, you don't make errors on the arithmetic. Your team have got their team agreements in place. And you really close the gap between sounds interesting and send me a term sheet to close an investment. So, question.
I have realized that a lot of angel groups are not directly investors, but they are middlemen towards high net worth individual, and they like to take like 5 to 7, sometimes even more commission.
Right.
What do you think about that?
So, I mean, there are many ways to get investments. You could go to an advisor who will find investors. You can go to London investor matchmaking events. You can go to an SEIS or EIS fund, which is essentially a collection of investors that high net worth, that someone gets together and they make the investment decisions, but they take typically, as you heard, 5 to 7%. Or you can go to a VC that invests and they've got investors sitting behind them. I don't think there's any right and wrong. A friend of mine worked for Cedars to say what would be a key indicator that a crowd round would be successful. And the key indicator that they found was the social influence of the founders. So if the founders had a big social following, essentially they were really good at working the crowd on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, they'd probably work the crowd on Crowdview. If the founders were an AI scientist and stayed around at home and never spoke to anyone, they were probably not right for a crowd round. So that might indicate crowd rounds. My favorite is always angel investors. And it's a favorite for a few reasons. One, the cost, there's no cost overhead on your side. I mean, there's some time to spread the word and try and find people, but the cost of capital is low. You're not paying anyone else overhead. The next thing is that if you have a fund, they usually want preference shares. They want a board seat. They might want you to pay their director. They want anti-dilution. So funds typically have a range of requirements that put you as a founder at a disadvantage, or rather gives them a set of investor protections that might make it harder for you to run your business, or ultimately make the cost of capital much higher. So many early stage funds might want a warrant so they can participate at a lower price in the future round. They want a preference share, which means when you sell your business, they get their money back first, and then everyone else shares in the value of the business. Let me explain that for a minute. So let's say as the founders you own 70% of the shares. The investors have 30%. You sell the business for £10 million. The founders get 7 million, the investors get 3, everyone's split according to the amount of shares you've got. This would be if everyone has what's called ordinary shares. If the investors have preference shares, it means they get their money back first, and then everyone else, possibly including them, splits the balance. So funds, or investors in general, would like to do this. And the reason is, if you imagine the exits of your company, they're probably like 3 scenarios. One, company runs at a 90 folds. Doesn't matter who got what, it's not worth anything. Scenario 2, you have a modest exit. You can't really get traction, and you do an active sale. So in other words, someone buys the team and the tech for a few £1 million. In scenario 3, it's going brilliantly, and you sell for 100 million. Let's say you've raised £3 million. If you raise £3 million and you sell the company for, let's say, £5 million, if it was angel investors and everyone had ordinary shares, the angel investors would have put in $3 million. They would own, let's say, 30% of the company. You sell the company for $5 million. They get back 30% of that. So they lose money, but everyone gets a fraction, an equal pro rata share of the sale price. If it was VCs with preference shares, they would get back their $3 million first, and then everyone would share the remaining $2 million. So the founders, even though they've got 70% of the shares, only would get a small fraction of the exit price. So your goal is to try as much as possible to avoid giving investors preference shares. And really the high point of this as an example is the UK esports company FanDuel, who sold for $500 million about a year and a half ago. It sounds fantastic. Small problem, they raised $500 million and they invested at preference shares. The founders got precisely zero. In fact, the investors wrote a check for $100 to each person, which I thought was a bit of a backhanded thing. So your goal is to avoid preference shares, which takes me neatly, give me one moment, to SEIS. So anyone not familiar with SEIS and EIS? All right, very briefly. So SEIS is a wonderful initiative from the government saying that as an angel investor, a UK taxpayer, when you invest in a startup that qualifies, you can write off 50% of your tax, of your investment in this tax year or backdate it. If you keep the shares for 3 years, you pay no capital gains tax. If the company goes bang, you can write off your investment. So it's excellent. But for founders, what most people didn't realize is it's very much in your favor too. So investors only get their SEIS tax breaks if they take what's called the ordinary risks of an investor. And this means they can't get preference shares, they can't get anti-dilution, they can't get any preferential things that let them kind of do the things that disadvantage you. So often an investor will say, can I get anti-dilution? That means if you raise at a lower round, I want you to, valuation, I want you to top me out. Or can I get non-dilution? This means I'm getting 10% of the company, but even off your next round, I still want to have 10% of the company. You should never ever do that. And it's sometimes hard to argue with the investors, but what's nice is if they've got SEIS or EIS, they basically have to get ordinary shares, and they can't do this diddling around. So now one of the key advantages of angel investors is simplified deal terms, and everyone gets ordinary shares, so the founders aren't disadvantaged in ways that people who don't get SEIS have always seemed to do. And that's not bad, by the way. I mean, the investor wants to protect their interests. They go, well, I don't know if you'll sell the company for a small amount. If so, I want my money back first. But you don't know how things are going to play out. You might put 5 years of your life into the company, and you sell for what's fine, but you get nothing because the investors got everything back first. And again, SEIS is your friend in that way. Question?
You mentioned about the equity side.
Yeah.
What about convertibles or debt equity? Is that any?
Right, a very good point. So there are basically, other than borrowing money from the bank, there are two broad ways of getting equity investment. One of them is you do a funding round. People give you money, you give them shares. But what if you don't know the valuation of the company yet? So you've got your bicycle lock, you've got your drawings. Is it worth £300,000? I mean, you put 20k into it. It can't really be worth 300,000. It's a fine idea. Or maybe you've got a certain level of traction and you need a bit more money to get it to launch or a marketing campaign, and then it will have a lot more traction, and you'd love to be able to raise the valuation later, which would be much higher, but you need the money now. So there's something called a convertible note. And a convertible note says the investor gives you money now, and you use the money, and you'll give them shares later at a valuation to be determined in a later funding round. It's a win-win, because you might give the investor to incentivize them maybe a 10 or 15 or 20% discount compared to what future investors would pay. You get to use the money now to grow the company and the valuation, and you don't need to value the company now. But a convertible note allows the investor to get interest potentially and potentially get their money back again as well on a sale of the company. And those two make it ineligible for SEIS. So convertible notes in its pure form are not popular in the UK, where 80% of all funding, sub £500,000 round is SEIS. It fuels the UK startup economy. But there's a variant called an advanced subscription agreement. We have it on Seed Legals, we call it a seed fast. And that means that an investor, literally after an event like this, someone says, I love what you're doing, can I invest 5k? And you go, I don't know the valuation, sure, let me send you a seed fast. The CFAST is SEIS compatible. And it says the investor gives you money now, it will convert into shares when you do a round, and to make it SEIS compatible, if you don't do a round, it will still convert in 12 months at a valuation what's called a low valuation. And these are now increasingly popular. And when you see the articles we've written on the data and how it transforms, this is essentially from 2018. In 2019, the shape is quite different, with a huge spike of people raising small amounts thanks to what I call continuous funding. And so people, well, one second. And so I feel like a drug dealer on a Sunday night when people will buy like 5 of these CFAST agreements for anywhere between £500 and £50,000. And it transforms the way that you can opportunistically raise funding when you meet an investor. So instead of having to get everyone on the bus in a funding round, the bus is going to leave in October, people individually you can get money from with the promise that it has the right investor protections and founder protections around it that will convert later. Question?
On the subject of angel investors, do you have some more general advice on how you can help find how you can go about looking for angel investors?
I think it's just the shamelessly spreading the word to everyone. I found a company whose business was to help you find angel investors, and the proposition was angel investors are probably people you know but didn't know that you knew, and therefore they mined your contacts. And I think it might pay someone to mine your contacts. You can just do this yourself, and you might try it. I mean, it might be an idea that works brilliantly or not. But the good news is the cost of doing it is $20 to pay MailChimp for a mail campaign, and some time honing your that 50-word pitch. And maybe, I mean, if you're raising a few £100,000, you don't need that many angel investors to fill that amount. Question at the back and then over there.
In UK, is it allowed to publicly advertise a funding raise for a startup?
So, I think if you put an ad in the Spectator saying guaranteed returns, then you'll probably run into FCA regulations. But I think there's no problem with pitching pitching an idea, and essentially you're going to have the person approach you to ask for your pitch deck, and if done to your limited social network and so on. I don't think
Okay, so we can publicly put that on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter.
I don't see any problem. I would be careful about offering guaranteed returns, but if it's phrased as developing an amazing new bicycle lock, raising 100k or whatever, drop me a note if you're interested, that sounds about right. Question and answer. Oh, quite a few questions, and you looking like I need to wrap up the back up here. So yeah, okay. Question.
What are the key differences between SEIS and EIS?
Good point. So SEIS, a company can raise £150,000 in SEIS, and the investors get a 50% tax deduction, and the company can then raise £10 million and sometimes more in EIS, and the investors get a 30% tax deduction. So SEIS is a little bit better. If you're raising £300,000, you can either say to your investors, first invest rest, or you can say everyone gets half SEIS and half EIS. You can mix and match it. But you can't, once you've issued any EIS, you can never do SEIS again. So you always do your SEIS first. Then there's a question.
How long after incorporation is SEIS and EIS good for?
Right, good point. So one of the limitations of SEIS is you can't have been trading for more than 2 years. You can have incorporated decades ago, but the clock starts from your first trade, which is a commercial sale, or offering the product available for sale. So yeah, if you happen to incorporate a few years ago, that's not a problem. Yeah.
So we incorporated a few years ago, we haven't generated any revenue from the core products, but we've done some consultancy, and we've generated revenue that way.
Right. So that's in fact a bit of a tricky grey area, which is you started a company, actually it was your pet company while you were doing some consulting work, and you built through the company, and now it's moved right along to something completely different, and HMRC may well say that the company earned revenue more than 2.5 years ago, and you essentially need to create a new company for your new endeavor. One of the things HMRC might look into is if you have created a new company, that it really is different. It's not like I had Bicycle Lock Co. and I've called it New Bike Co. It's obvious I just started this and moved all the IP from here to here, so be aware of that. Question?
So if you're raising from a bunch of angel investors, do you normally get, like, how often can you fix the valuations of all of them are 10 or 15%, at that valuation, or do you have to individually negotiate the
Great question. How do you set the valuation? I think, I don't know the answer. I think it's a bit like herding cats. So I would have the following bits of advice. Number one, probably talk to a couple of investors first to gauge the valuation. If they're all telling you that it's way off, you might want to think about it. Two, try to scientifically justify your valuation. So using our graph or something else to go, look, I've run the numbers, I've looked at this, I think this is the valuation. So rather than I made it up, it's here to discuss, try to push for that. I think number three, try to find a lead investor typically, and that might be the one putting the biggest amount. And you may, I mean, legally you can call it a lead investor, but it might just be my sort of main investor, and then others will follow them. It might be the best known angel investor on the list, the person putting the biggest amount, a VC friend, and then that anchors it, and everyone else just goes, yep, I'm in or not. Try to avoid giving people different valuations. It's possible that you can give people discounts, but the problem is when people sign the shareholders agreement, everyone sees what everyone else is paying. So if I promise you one valuation and you something else, and you discover it, then it becomes a race to the bottom. Why did he get a better deal? And then you have to so avoid that. And yes, it's unavoidable that this becomes a big part of the round, figuring out the valuation. When we wanted to raise money, we just did our Series A, we raised £3 million, but we saw our business growing, we saw our revenue, we decided the valuation we wanted, and then we had investors, funds, very much interested, but at different valuations. So we essentially shopped around until we got the valuation we wanted, and went with that fund and said, thanks to the others. So depending on how sort of experienced you are and how fixed you are, you're going to play the game in different ways. Question back to there, so do you have a question? No? Okay.
Yes, hi. I wanted to ask about the co-founder problem. You said
Yes,
a good lever is a dead lever. What happens if your co-founder is actually dead to the company, but is not really dead? For example, he's not doing his work. But he's not doing his work, so he's taking 6 months to do something that will take a week, but it's not really leaving. What sort of legal options do you have?
Yeah, that's a gnarly problem because I think, so were you to have an employee, with an employee it's generally quite easy because they've got an employment agreement, there's someone they report to, they've got a certain number of hours they need to be in, if they're not performing, then there's a 30-day termination or whatever it is. But the problem with the founder, the reason you became a founder is you didn't want that kind of employee stuff. You want to be your own person. And the legal documents make it quite clear if you're out, then these things happen, but the definition of are you in or out may have to be that something you can only resolve internally. It may be that ultimately the board can fire the person and the board is the set of directors. Some people think you only have a board later. No, when you incorporate on Company House, whoever's the director, that is the board. So it's possible that the person with the most votes can vote out the other person, but it becomes a bit difficult. You might have to show the person really wasn't working. Those kind of problems may be difficult to address legally, and you may just have to address between you. Those are the difficult ones. Yeah. Question?
The very quick one, give me find out typically, how long can the funding round last?
How long can the round last? It's a good question. The record I think we've seen is 23 hours in terms of the short end and months at the long end. I mean, the funding rounds can go up for 6 months. I think one of the things that I find, you know, your goal is to set a goal, raise money, and get on with business. Raising money is a distraction from your real business. So you want to do it quickly and efficiently. I think the ones that probably irk me the most are what I call friendly fire from the founders. They've got around pretty much good to go. We've got it. It's like, I think I'll just raise a bit more. And then they add on another investor. What often happens is you struggle for ages to find investors, and then the word gets out that you're oversubscribed, and suddenly everyone wants in. Top tip: try really hard to avoid increasing the valuation. So you might go, I'm looking to raise 300K, and now, and I'm giving away 15%, great. And now, someone wants to invest 50K more. That would mean I'm giving away 20%, unless I increase the valuation. If you go back to your investors who said, I'm in, and you told them, I've changed the valuation, different people will take it in different ways, but some pro-angel investors I know tell them, if you come to them afterwards and you tell them you've raised the valuation, they're out on an irrevocable, I'm not talking to you again, basis. So be aware, and when we did our first round, we took quite a while closing our round, because we weren't in a big rush and we wanted to get the platform perfect, because we wanted to build the platform, and actually we ended up raising much more than we wanted, but we decided not to change the valuation because we just thought it was not the right thing to do. So yes, I think the friendly fire is keep increasing the scope of the round when you could have just closed it quickly and topped up later. I'll take one more question for now. Question?
For the angel investors in the UK, do they have to have some sort of
Right, so great point. Can anyone be an angel investor? And the answer is yes. If you really want to, you can get the person to sign a high net worth certificate or a sophisticated certificate, sophisticated investor, or what's called an everyday investor certificate. You find all of these free on Seed Legals. I think hardly anyone bothers, but if you feel that you want the protection, you can ask them to do so. But otherwise, anyone can invest. All right, I think I'm pretty much done. A couple of quick technical things when you're talking to investors. Pre-money valuation is a valuation before your round. And post-money valuation is a valuation after you've added the investment in the round. They're both mathematically equivalent. My suggestion is always talk about pre-money valuation. So I'm looking to raise £500,000. I'm looking to raise, sorry, £100,000 on a £500,000 pre-money valuation, giving away 16% equity. This is complete clarity for the investor. If you said I'm raising $100,000 on a $500,000 valuation, the investor doesn't know whether that's $500,000 before the round or $500,000 after. If they're a bit opportunistic or they don't know, they might think that it's the valuation afterwards, and then the valuation before was $400,000. So instead of them getting 16%, they're going to get 20% equity. And when they discover they're getting 16, there's an unhappy conversation that requires you to lower the valuation. Sometimes your investor is an expert in this, and sometimes they know less than you. So showing that you have knowledge, you're open and transparent, I think firstly avoids any unhappy arguments later. Secondly, establishes to the investor you know what you're doing. And thirdly, has them trust that you're sharing information. So if you can say the magic, I'm raising X amount at this pre-money valuation, giving away this percent equity is good, but you then have to very carefully check that you've got the numbers right, because you can calculate the relationships. If you've got it wrong, no one's going to believe your 3-year business plan after that. So, I've covered that after the round, be careful of giving people shares because they have value. One quick thing on advisors. So often people, in my view, really overvalue advisors. So I need some advisors to put on my pitch deck and so on. blockchain or ICOs were built with advisors. We've got some blockchain guru is an advisor we're in. But I must say, if I had a choice of giving £30,000 a year to a developer who's going to sit with me 5 days a week and help build the product, versus giving £30,000 to an advisor who's going to pitch up once a month with words of wisdom that disappear, I would always opt for someone who's part of the core team. And so I'm not a big fan of advisors. I've been a very well-paid advisor in the past. You breeze in, you go, yeah, I think you should do X, Y, and Z. Build a SaaS business, and then you come back a month later and go, it doesn't really work. You go, don't look at me. So we've got data on the Seed Legal's resources deal data about how much equity to give to an advisor. Again, just like the employee, think of it as a cash equivalent. So if the person says, I'm looking for 3% equity for being an advisor, great. If that will vest over 2 years, because you always give equity with the vesting unless someone's paying for the shares, then that's 1.5% of the year. The company's £500,000 valuation, let's say, so that's £7,500 in cash equivalent for a day a month for an advisor. Yeah, that sounds about right. But if they wanted 3x that, or to get it in 1 year, maybe it's a big disparity. So again, think about the amount in cash, and then also think about truly how much value they're going to bring. Sometimes it looks good on the slide deck. Do investors really care? And after the slide deck's done, you've got this person that you've given equity to that's really never going to be helpful after that. Question?
Just to be clear, when you talk about advisors, are you talking, are they the same as the sort of the non-executive directors?
Right, so an advisor can have one of two roles. One, they just sit there as being an advisor, they give you advice. And sometimes they're really well connected in the industry, and they'll, your lipstick company, they'll do an intro to, whichever, L'Oreal or whatever. You don't need much of their time, but they've got fantastic knowledge and networking. Well, the second one is they're going to be a board director, non-exec director, and as the board, they've got some responsibilities, and they're there to give guidance to the company. My take is only have someone on your board that you actually want. As a director, they've got responsibilities. I mean, they can be fined if the company goes bang or whatever it is, or trades insolvent. So they've got real responsibilities. But they can also start pushing the company to do things, and you lose some control as the founder. So sometimes people go, I need people for my board. Well, I'm not sure. Often investors, funds, will insist on having someone on the board. You can't avoid that, but my take is only have someone on your board unless they really are providing value on an ongoing basis. I think that is it for me. Last question back there.
Yeah. So I'm raising the first round, but haven't done it yet. Is it possible, for example, to give £10,000 worth of shares to an advisor at the valuation of the coming round, or is it bad from a tax implication?
A brilliant question that sums up quite a lot of things that I've suggested. So thing one is when you say £10,000 worth of shares, of course, based on what is it £10,000? But let's say on the value of your round. What you then want to do simultaneously is persuade your advisor this is £10,000 worth of value, but give them shares when they really have a zero value, otherwise she's going to pay tax on that. So you're going to say, look, I'm going to raise later on, I think at this valuation, you're getting 1%, so that's £10,000. It's well before the funding round. My shares are still worth nothing. So we're going to do the following. One, I'm going to do an advisor agreement with you on Seed Legal for free, saying you're going to get no equity, you're going to do these responsibilities, always make sure that there's some paperwork that says what they need to do, and you're going to get your shares vesting over a year. Never give people shares without a vesting schedule, because what if they don't perform? Great. Then what you need to do is you need to now make these shares. And the way you make these shares, assuming the shares have no value and the founders and any shareholders, is super easy. You go to a company's house, or you Google download SH01 document, and you now make a SH01 to give them some number of shares. And they've got the agreement that says if they don't perform, they have to give some back. And this document makes the shares. But the next thing is, let's say you've got 1,000 shares. How many shares are you going to give them for 1%? The answer is not 10, it's like 11 and a bit, because then they'll have 1% out of 1,000 and 11 and a bit. So you've got two problems. One, I mean, you can make the 11 shares, but you can't accurately perhaps give them 1%, and so you need to do a share split to make like 100,000 shares, and then you can easily give them, 1,001 or something like that, which is going to be 1,010, which is 1%. Anyway, you'll find all that info there on
I thought that we create the shares on ACH1 once the vesting is done.
No.
My accountant told me that.
No, they're wrong, because if you're giving them shares, they need to get the shares now. So if they get the shares later, they'll have a value and they'll pay tax. If you give them share options, the shares get created later. So, change your options. All right. Thank you. I'm around. I'm Anthony at clegals.com. We're in Holborn if anyone wants to visit. I think I told 90 minutes. I have no idea how long we'll be talking for, but those are great questions. Thank you very much.
I'm Neil from Exponential. We organise these events for you guys, but what we also do is we hold events here as well, normally in the evenings, where we fill a room like this, but with potential investors who are looking to invest in companies. Yeah, we hold these regularly once at the end of the month here. You can have a look at our website, my cards are over there as well. Just take them, have a look. It's free.